The nearly trillion-dollar economic relationship between Canada and the United States faces unprecedented tension as Donald Trump threatens to annex Canada through economic force. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau responded firmly, stating there is not a snowball's chance in hell that Canada would join the United States. The stakes are extraordinarily high, with approximately $2.5 billion worth of goods and services crossing the Canada-America border daily. However, Trump has escalated tensions by threatening to impose a substantial 25% tariff on Canadian goods unless Canada increases its border security measures. As a result, this economic pressure could significantly impact critical trade sectors, including oil, gas, electricity, steel, aluminum, and lumber, essential commodities that would become more expensive for American consumers if such measures were implemented. What do you think about this? Will Trump's threat make things worse for the Canadian economy? Before we delve deeper into this issue, please share your thoughts. Economic force in international relations encompasses the use of economic means against a country to weaken its economy and consequently reduce its political and military power. Specifically, this strategy involves using economic leverage to compel an adversary to change its policies or behavior through various mechanisms. Key tools of economic warfare include trade embargoes, boycotts, sanctions, discriminatory tariffs, freezing of capital assets, suspension of aid, and restrictions on investment flows. Furthermore, historical evidence demonstrates that economic coercion often imposes greater costs on the general population than on political or military leaders. Economic statecraft has evolved into a sophisticated tool of foreign policy, particularly when wielded by larger economies against smaller, democratic nations. Moreover, recent global examples highlight the effectiveness of economic coercion. Between 2008 and 2022, 18 Western and Asian countries faced discriminatory sanctions and embargoes, resulting in tens of billions of dollars in economic damage. Notably, after facing sanctions, several nations modified their political positions to align with the coercing country's demands. President-elect Trump's specific threats against Canada represent an unprecedented escalation in North American relations. His administration has threatened to implement sweeping 25% tariffs on Canadian goods. The president-elect has repeatedly linked these economic measures to his stated goal of making Canada become another U.S. state. The Canadian government, under Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's leadership, has assembled comprehensive countermeasures. These include potential retaliatory tariffs on U.S. exports and strategic restrictions on key Canadian exports to the United States. Additionally, Canadian officials have indicated their willingness to impose tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of goods exported to the United States. Particularly noteworthy is Trump's argument regarding the trade relationship, claiming that Canada maintains a trade surplus while benefiting from U.S. defense guarantees. Nevertheless, economic experts warn that implementing such tariffs would initiate an all-out trade war, ultimately harming both nations' economies and consumers. Recent economic analysis reveals the severe implications of Trump's proposed 25% tariff strategy against Canada. According to the Canadian Chamber of Commerce's Business Data Lab, this measure would shrink Canada's GDP by 6%, approximately 78 billion Canadian dollars, resulting in an annual cost of $900 per Canadian. Simultaneously, the U.S. economy would contract by 6%, roughly $467 billion, costing each American about $1,300 annually. The implementation of sweeping tariffs would create substantial economic disruption across North America. Studies indicate that a full-scale implementation could reduce Canadian export volumes to the U.S. by nearly 5% by early 2027. Certainly, this would force the Bank of Canada to cut interest rates by 50 to 75 basis points, more than currently forecast. Trade restrictions could have a particularly severe impact on critical industrial sectors. The automotive industry would be the hardest hit, with 20% of its intermediary goods sourced from the United States. Other sectors, including energy, chemical manufacturing, forestry products, and machinery, also exhibit significant vulnerability to disruptions in the U.S. market. Financial market analysis demonstrates the extensive integration between both economies. U.S. macroeconomic news accounts for up to 35% of quarterly changes in two-year Canadian bond yields. Overall, This interconnection suggests that market disruptions would have cascading effects across both economies. The Canadian government has prepared substantial countermeasures, including potential retaliatory tariffs on up to 150 billion Canadian dollars, equivalent to $105 billion worth of US imports. During preliminary discussions, Canadian officials have identified hundreds of US-made goods for possible retaliatory tariffs. A comparison of market impacts reveals significant economic consequences for both Canada and the United States. Canada's GDP would decline by 2.6%, compared to a 1.6% reduction in the US GDP. On a per-person basis, Canadians would bear a cost of approximately $1,900, while Americans would face a lower impact of $1,300. Additionally, Canada relies heavily on trade with the United States, with 75% of its exports destined for its southern neighbor, which remains its top trading partner. Subsequently, these measures could trigger emergency relief programs for industries facing layoff risks. Ontario alone could potentially lose up to 500,000 jobs, according to Premier Doug Ford's estimates. Alberta might face approximately 50,000 job losses based on current financial forecasts. Canada's extensive economic integration with the United States makes it uniquely vulnerable to proposed tariff measures. Indeed, the bilateral trade relationship supports millions of jobs, with nearly $360 billion Canadian dollars worth of goods and services crossing the border daily. The Canadian economy demonstrates significant exposure to US trade relations, with domestic merchandise exports to the US totaling $548 billion in 2023, representing approximately 77% of Canada's total exports. Therefore, any disruption to this trading relationship poses substantial risks to Canada's economic stability. Generally, economists project that a 25% tariff implementation could reduce Canada's GDP by 2.6%, resulting in an average annual cost of $1,900 per Canadian household. An examination of important industries pointed out the regions most susceptible to possible US tariffs, together accounting for more than 40% of Canada's total exports to the United States are energy exports valued at $166 billion and motor cars and parts valued at $82 billion. Though 88% of Canadian energy exports still find their way to the United States, the manufacturing sector bears serious threats. Apart from aerospace products, other impacted sectors include chemical, plastic, and rubber manufacturing. The economic impact of potential tariffs would vary widely across Canadian provinces. Ontario faces significant risks in manufacturing and the automotive sector, with up to 500,000 jobs at stake. Alberta, heavily reliant on energy exports with 83% bound for the US, could see 50,000 job losses. Quebec, with its aerospace and manufacturing industries, is highly exposed to the US market. New Brunswick's energy sector, where over 70% of exports are US bound, also faces considerable vulnerability. Notwithstanding these challenges, the Canadian economy has demonstrated resilience, expanding by approximately 2% in the first half of the current year. Although population growth remains strong at around 2.75%, GDP per person likely declined by about 1.25%. Rather than accepting these economic pressures, Canadian businesses are preparing adaptive measures. Undoubtedly, about 65% of small businesses indicate they would need to increase consumer prices to offset tariff impacts. Eventually, this could lead to higher costs of doing business, with 69% of small business owners expressing concern about increased operational expenses. Despite these challenges, some sectors maintain greater insulation from US market dependence. For instance, metal ores, non-metallic minerals industries, and the agriculture sector show relatively lower exposure, with only 25% and 50% of their exports, respectively, destined for the US market. The legal framework governing US-Canada relations presents substantial barriers to any attempted economic annexation. Initially, the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement, or CUSMA, which entered into force in July 2020, serves as the primary legal instrument reinforcing Canada's economic sovereignty. The World Trade Organization Agreement on Technical Barriers to Trade establishes fundamental rules aimed at preventing coercive economic measures. Presently, Trade restrictions across the globe have reached unprecedented levels, with nearly 3,000 restrictions imposed in 2023. These developments are shaped by key legal constraints, including the prohibition of discriminatory trade practices, the requirement for fair dispute resolution, protections against unilateral trade actions, and safeguards designed to prevent economic coercion. The USMCA agreement offers specific protections for its member nations, exemplified by the processing of 13 labor complaints through its rapid response labor mechanism. Alongside these provisions, the agreement includes several critical safeguards. Dispute settlement is facilitated through a binational mechanism for most conflicts, while trade commitments ensure zero tariffs across numerous sectors. Additionally, economic security is bolstered by measures to enhance supply chain resilience. Important to realize that the agreement has facilitated approximately $80 trillion in goods and services trade between member nations in 2022. Likewise, U.S. goods exports to USMCA partners reached $80 billion in 2022, representing a 0% increase from the previous year. Similar to other international agreements, the USMCA establishes a balanced trading relationship supported by resilient supply chains across vital economic sectors. The constitutional framework ensures several protective measures, including the implementation of trade agreements requiring legislative approval, compliance with international law, and mutual consent for modifications. It also upholds sovereignty by preserving national autonomy in key sectors, maintaining an independent monetary policy, and protecting territorial integrity. In essence, any attempt to use economic force for territorial acquisition would contravene multiple international laws and agreements. The repercussions would extend beyond bilateral relations, potentially alienating NATO allies and weakening collective security efforts, particularly in the Arctic where cooperation remains essential. In response to Trump's economic threats, Canadian officials have prepared extensive countermeasures worth $150 billion Canadian dollars, equivalent to $105 billion in retaliatory actions. The federal government, alongside provincial leaders, has developed a multifaceted strategy to protect Canadian sovereignty and economic interests. The Canadian government has outlined a three-tiered approach to counter potential U.S. tariffs. Straight away, officials would target specific U.S. products, markedly Florida orange juice, as an immediate response. The government's strategy embraces Prime Minister Trudeau's principle of dollar-for-dollar response, with preparations for tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of U.S. exports. Key targeted sectors include Florida citrus products, Kentucky bourbon, Pennsylvania steel, and strategic manufacturing inputs. Canada's energy exports are a formidable bargaining tool, with the United States depending on Canada for more than half of its oil imports. Additionally, Ontario's electricity exports alone are enough to power around 1.5 million American households and businesses. Given this interdependence, the premiers of Ontario, Quebec, and Newfoundland have expressed support for using energy exports as a strategic means of influence. Provincial positions on energy export restrictions vary based on the resources each province controls. Ontario, for instance, advocates for restrictions on electricity exports, recognizing its role in meeting U.S. energy demands. Quebec supports leveraging its abundant hydroelectric power, viewing it as a vital resource in any strategic maneuver. On the other hand, Alberta opposes such restrictions, focusing instead on the importance of its oil exports for both economic and political leverage. Newfoundland also backs using its energy resources strategically, recognizing the value of its energy exports in shaping international relations. Each province's stance underscores the importance of energy as a key resource in Canada's broader economic and geopolitical strategy. The federal government has implemented a comprehensive Team Canada approach, henceforth coordinating with provinces to present a unified response. Soon after Trump's threats, the government established mechanisms to provide financial support for affected workers and businesses. British Columbia has demonstrated flexibility in its strategic approach, considering restrictions on critical mineral exports, such as those from Teck Resources smelter. The province recognizes the importance of maintaining multiple options while emphasizing the value of cross-border cooperation in areas like wildfire management. The Canadian government's strategy also includes diplomatic initiatives, with legislators actively engaging U.S. counterparts through direct visits to Trump's Mar-a-Lago resort in Florida. These efforts aim to prevent tariff implementation while preparing robust countermeasures if diplomacy fails. Economic forecasts suggest Canada's GDP could decline between 1.8% and 3.38% under a 25% blanket tariff scenario, depending on the nature and extent of Canadian retaliation. The government's defense strategy includes provisions for sector-specific support, recognizing that certain industries may require targeted assistance to weather potential economic disruptions. Canadian businesses face unprecedented challenges as Trump's economic threats cast a shadow over North American trade relations. A recent survey by the Canadian Federation of Independent Business reveals that 82% of businesses would be impacted by potential tariffs. A comprehensive corporate risk assessment reveals that a significant portion of the business community is highly vulnerable to the economic repercussions of potential tariffs. According to the findings, 65% of small businesses would be forced to raise prices for consumers to offset the financial strain caused by tariffs. At the same time, 69% of business owners expect their operational costs to rise significantly, which would place additional pressure on their ability to remain competitive in the market. The business impact analysis sheds light on the primary concerns of different sectors. In manufacturing, companies are particularly worried about disruptions to their supply chains, given the sector's deep integration with the U.S. market. The energy sector, with 80% of its exports bound for the United States, is highly exposed to the risk of export restrictions, which could severely impact its revenues. The automotive sector faces challenges related to the rising cost of components, especially as 20% of its parts are sourced from the U.S., making it vulnerable to any changes in trade dynamics. Meanwhile, the agricultural sector has moderate exposure, with its main concern being the potential loss of market access, which could significantly affect exports and pricing. In anticipation of potential challenges, businesses have already started taking proactive steps to protect themselves. Many companies are diversifying their supply chains to reduce reliance on any single source, while also developing strategies to tap into alternative markets. In addition, they are putting in place cost management protocols to control expenses more effectively and are preparing contingency plans to address possible trade disruptions. The Canadian Chamber of Commerce analysis indicates that trade with Canada accounts for varying degrees of economic activity across U.S. states: Montana, 16%, Michigan, 14%, and Illinois, 10%. Primarily, this interdependence affects both nations' business communities, with Canadian provincial economies showing significant exposure: New Brunswick, 62%, Manitoba and Alberta, 42%, and Ontario, 41%. Market volatility has led businesses to reconsider their long-term strategies as economic uncertainty continues to rise. According to projections by Oxford Economics, the implementation of blanket 25% tariffs, along with proportional retaliatory measures, is expected to push Canada into a recession by 2025. The analysis predicts a 5% reduction in GDP by early 2026, an inflation spike reaching 2% by mid-2025, and a loss of 150,000 jobs, which would drive the unemployment rate to 9% by the end of 2025. The energy sector, automotive industry, and heavy manufacturing face the greatest exposure due to their high degree of cross-border integration. Similarly, supply chain disruptions would significantly impact American manufacturers and local economies, as Canada serves as the primary export market for 34 U.S. states. Conversely, some sectors demonstrate greater resilience through market diversification. The metal ores and non-metallic minerals industries maintain lower exposure to U.S. market dependence. Business analysts suggest that companies with diversified market presence show better positioning to weather potential trade disruptions. The uncertainty has prompted a surge in corporate risk assessment activities, with businesses developing comprehensive contingency plans. ING's market analysis suggests the USD-CAD exchange rate could climb to 1.55 in 2025, potentially benefiting export-oriented companies, but creating challenges for those reliant on imports. The profound economic integration between the United States and Canada represents one of the world's most interconnected bilateral relationships, with approximately $360 billion in goods and services crossing their shared border daily. The economic ties between the United States and Canada reflect a deeply intertwined relationship, shaped by substantial trade and mutual dependence across various sectors. In 2022, U.S. goods and services trade with Canada totaled an impressive $90 billion, a clear indication of the strength and scale of their economic interconnection. This relationship directly supports a significant number of jobs on both sides of the border. Specifically, approximately 1.4 million American jobs are tied to Canadian exports, while about 2.3 million Canadian jobs depend on U.S. exports. Additionally, nearly 50% of bilateral trade occurs between related companies, highlighting the close and strategic partnerships that exist within this economic framework. Trade statistics from 2022 further illustrate the depth of this integration. U.S. exports to Canada reached $427.70 billion, while imports from Canada totaled $481.20 billion. In terms of services, the U.S. exported $71.30 billion in services to Canada, while it imported $44.60 billion. These figures demonstrate not only the scale of trade between the two nations, but also the interdependent nature of their economic relationship, underlining the importance of maintaining a stable and cooperative trade environment. Beforehand, this economic partnership has yielded substantial advantages. Fundamentally, Canada serves as the leading importer of U.S. agricultural products. Essentially, the integration extends beyond mere trade, with U.S. foreign direct investment in Canada reaching $438.80 billion in 2022. The benefits encompass enhanced market access, streamlined supply chains, technological collaboration, and shared innovation capabilities. Primarily, the drawbacks emerge from asymmetric dependence. Notably, Canada relies on the United States for 75% of its exports. Thus, this imbalance creates vulnerability to economic pressure, as demonstrated by the potential impact of proposed tariffs. Economic forecasts indicate a range of potential outcomes depending on the extent of tariffs implemented between the United States and Canada. Under a scenario where a 10% tariff is imposed, the Canadian economy could experience a contraction of 2.4 percentage points in its GDP. This would put roughly 500,000 jobs at risk across various sectors, highlighting the vulnerability of Canada's labour market to tariff-related disruptions. On the US side, the tariff imposition could lead to an increase in the deficit by a staggering $350 to $4.0 trillion, placing considerable strain on the American economy. However, the scenario of a more aggressive 25% tariff would have even more severe consequences. The impact on Canada's job market would be tripled, with up to 1.5 million positions potentially lost across diverse industries. Such a scenario could lead to permanent structural shifts in trade patterns, as businesses and industries may adjust to the new economic realities by seeking alternative markets and suppliers. Additionally, the imposition of such tariffs would likely trigger significant disruptions in supply chains, affecting everything from manufacturing to energy production and delivery. Ultimately, the automotive sector faces particular vulnerability, with 20% of its inputs sourced across borders. Correspondingly, the energy sector maintains strategic importance, as Canada remains the largest exporter of energy to the United States. The United States and Canada have established various mechanisms to strengthen their economic partnership. The Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement serves to reinforce these economic ties. Both nations collaborate on critical initiatives, including a $250 million Defense Production Act funding for mining and processing critical minerals. Sweeping policy changes loom on the horizon as both nations grapple with unprecedented economic tensions. The Canadian government has launched a 45-day consultation on economic security, remaining open until September 23, 2024, to strengthen the nation's economic security and supply chain resilience. The upcoming review of the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement in 2026 holds significant implications for both nations, as it will determine the future course of their economic relationship. As part of this process, the Canadian government is under increasing pressure to adopt strategic trade policies that can effectively address the challenges posed by evolving global dynamics. Among the key measures being considered is enhanced enforcement of trade remedies, which would involve strengthening the mechanisms to resolve disputes and ensure compliance with the agreement. Additionally, There is a push for the introduction of investigative powers to better monitor trade practices and identify potential violations. Expanding unilateral export controls is another option on the table, which would give Canada more control over its exports in response to shifting market conditions. Moreover, implementing supply-based policy measures is seen as crucial to ensuring that Canada's domestic industries are protected from external pressures, particularly in sectors deemed vital to national interests. At the same time, the Bank of Canada has forecasted that trade patterns will be increasingly reshaped by three major forces that are already at play in the global economic landscape. First, there is rewiring, referring to the shifting international economics and supply chains as countries adapt to new realities, such as geopolitical tensions and technological advances. This rewiring is leading to a restructuring of global production networks as businesses seek more resilient and diversified supply chains. Second, recasting refers to the growing importance of national security considerations in trade policy. As nations place greater emphasis on protecting critical industries and infrastructure, trade agreements and policies are being adjusted to reflect these concerns. Lastly, redirecting signifies the shifting global trade flows through new restrictions, where countries are imposing more targeted tariffs, sanctions, and other trade barriers to influence international commerce. These three forces combined suggest that trade relations are evolving in ways that could significantly impact the way Canada and the US engage with one another and the wider world in the coming years. The Canadian government has put forward a series of comprehensive economic security measures aimed at strengthening the nation's resilience in key areas. These measures are focused on critical sectors, with particular attention given to the protection and management of supply chains, especially those involving vital resources such as critical minerals and semiconductors. In terms of trade defense, there is a specific emphasis on monitoring the steel and aluminum industries to prevent unfair practices and maintain market stability. Digital security is also a priority, with efforts directed at safeguarding internet infrastructure from potential cyber threats. Additionally, the government is implementing protective measures for strategic industries, such as the electric vehicle sector, to ensure their continued growth and competitiveness in an increasingly globalized economy. Essentially, these measures aim to defend against unfair trade practices while bolstering national security. The government has introduced restrictive supply-based policy measures targeting critical sectors where entities pose risks to Canada's economic and national security interests. The bilateral relationship between Canada and the United States is undergoing significant structural transformation across several dimensions. Over the past decade, trade as a share of Canada's GDP has remained stable at around 2/3, positioning Canada as the second highest in the G7 and fourth highest in the G20 in terms of trade dependence. Potential policy shifts in this context could lead to substantial changes in both trade and economic security frameworks. These shifts may include the implementation of new tariff structures aimed at adjusting trade dynamics and the introduction of enhanced border security measures designed to better manage cross-border trade. Additionally, there may be a push for more robust supply chain monitoring to ensure the integrity and resilience of essential sectors. On the economic security front, Canada could consider implementing export duties on critical products to protect its resources, as well as investing in the resilience of its critical minerals supply chain. Furthermore, there may be an increased focus on regulatory oversight to ensure that industries remain secure and competitive amidst evolving global challenges. Beforehand, Canadian businesses have begun preparing for potential policy changes. Studies indicate that 65% of small businesses would need to increase consumer prices to offset tariff impacts. Thereby, about 69% of business owners express concern about increased operational expenses. The Canadian government's policy response includes investing in trade infrastructure and reducing trade barriers to make North American value chain integration more attractive for businesses. Ultimately, this encompasses investments in electricity grid and transportation infrastructure improvements. The transformation of bilateral relations extends beyond traditional trade metrics. Canada maintains its position as a trusted and reliable trading partner, offering advantages through a highly skilled labor force, reliable energy networks, solid financial institutions, a stable democratic system, and a strong rule of law. The policy landscape continues evolving as Canada implements new security measures along the border, including strengthened surveillance and the addition of a joint strike force to target transnational organized crime. Furthermore, Canada has committed to increasing its military spending from CAD 27 billion to almost CAD 50 billion by 2030. Ontario, representing a significant portion of bilateral trade, maintains deep economic ties with the United States, with trade totaling more than CAD 493 billion in 2023. The province's premier has emphasized the strategic importance of these relationships, notably in the energy sector, where Ontario's electricity exports power approximately 1.5 million American homes and businesses. The economic challenges facing Canada highlight the deep interdependence between the US and Canada. A trade conflict could significantly harm both economies, but Canada is preparing strong countermeasures to protect its sovereignty and industries. Many Canadian businesses are already diversifying and planning for potential disruptions. The future of US-Canada relations depends on finding a balance between economic ties and national sovereignty. What do you think? Will cooperation or pressure be the key to maintaining strong relations? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. Thank you for watching.